Hello, Pioneer Grandma here. Pioneer stories. I loved them as a child. I read them to my children. I read them to my grandchildren. I read them to my students when I was a classroom teacher. And now I have more grandchildren to read to, but they live far away. So I went to the local library and I found some wonderful stories. They have amazing things there. You should go check it out. So now here I am in my modern day covered wagon down by the river reading pioneer stories to my grandchildren, to my great-grandchildren, and to you. When we get done, I'll open a Dove chocolate and share the secret message inside with you. Sometimes I might have apples, and if I bring my little dog Chewbacca, I'll bring a doggy treat for him. And then I'll read the special message out of a box that I keep with messages in it. I'm so very glad that you're here. So we're in the modern day covered wagon and we're reading part 2 of Sarah Plain and Tall. If you haven't heard part 1 yet, you might want to go back and listen to that. I'll put a link in the description below. Last time Anna and Caleb and their father live on the prairie. Their mother has passed away, and so their father has written away for a mail order bride and a mother for them. They've written back and forth to Sarah, and Sarah's coming from Maine. The children are anxiously awaiting her arrival. Chapter 3. Sarah came in the spring. She came through green grass fields that bloomed with Indian paintbrush, red and orange, and blue-eyed grass. Papa got up early for the long day's trip to the train and back. He brushed his hair so slick and shiny that Caleb laughed. He wore a clean blue shirt and a belt instead of suspenders. He fed and watered the horses, talking to them as he hitched them up to the wagon. Old Bess, calm and kind. Jack, wild-eyed, reaching over to nip Bess on the neck. "Clear day, Bess," said Papa, rubbing her nose. "Settle down, Jack." He leaned his head on Jack. Then Papa drove off along the dirt road to fetch Sarah, Papa's new wife. Maybe our new mother. Gophers ran back and forth across the road, stopping to stand up and watch the wagon. Far off in the field, a woodchuck ate and listened. Caleb and I did our chores without talking. We shoveled out the stalls and laid down new hay. We fed the sheep. We swept and straightened and carried wood and water, and then our chores were done. Caleb pulled on my shirt. "Is my face clean?" he asked. "Can my face be too clean?" He looked alarmed. "No, your face is clean, but not too clean," I said. Caleb slipped his hand into mine as we stood on the porch watching the road. He was afraid. "Will she be nice?" he asked. "Like Maggie?" "Sarah will be nice," I told him. "How far away is Maine?" he asked. "You know how far away by the sea." "Will Sarah bring some sea?" he asked. "No, you cannot bring the sea." The sheep ran in the field, and far off the cows moved slowly to the pond, like turtles. "Will she like us?" asked Caleb very softly. I watched a marsh hawk wheel down behind the barn. He looked up at me. "Of course she will like us." He answered his own question. "We are nice," he added, making me smile. We waited and watched. I rocked on the porch, and Caleb rolled a marble on the wood floor, back and forth, back and forth. The marble was blue. We saw the dust from the wagon first, rising above the road, above the heads of Jack and old Bess. Caleb climbed up on the porch roof and shaded his eyes. "A bonnet!" he cried. "I see a yellow bonnet!" The dogs came out from under the porch, ears up, their eyes on the cloud of dust bringing Sarah. The wagon passed the fence field, and the cows and the sheep looked up too. It rounded the windmill and the barn and the windbreak of Russian olive that Mama had planted long ago. Nick began to bark, then Lottie, and the wagon clattered into the yard and stopped by the steps. "Hush," said Papa to the dogs, and it was quiet. Sarah stepped down from the wagon, a cloth bag in her hand. She reached up and took off her yellow bonnet, smoothing back her brown hair into a bun. She was plain and tall. "Did you bring some sea?" asked Caleb beside me. "Something from the sea," said Sarah, smiling. "And me." She turned and lifted a black case from the wagon, and seal too. Carefully, She opened the case, and Seal, gray with white feet, stepped out. Lottie lay down, her head on her paws, staring. Nick leaned down to sniff, then he lay down too. "The cat will be good in the barn," said Papa, "for mice." Sarah smiled. "She'll be good in the house, too." Sarah took Caleb's hand, then mine. Her hands were large and rough. She gave Caleb a shell, a moon snail, she called it, that was curled and smelled of salt. "The gulls fly high and drop the shells on the rocks below," she told Caleb. "When the shell is broken, they eat what is inside." "That is very smart," said Caleb. "For you, Anna," said Sarah, "a sea stone." And she gave me the smoothest and whitest stone I had ever seen. The sea washes over and over and around the stone, rolling it until it is round and perfect. "And that is very smart too," said Caleb. He looked up at Sarah. "We do not have the sea here." Sarah turned and looked out over the plains. "No, there is no sea here, but the land rolls a little like the sea." My father did not see her look, but I did, and I knew that Caleb had seen it too. Sarah was not smiling. Sarah was already lonely. In a month's time, the preacher might come to marry Sarah and Papa. And a month was a long time enough for her to change her mind and leave us. Papa took Sarah's bags inside, where her room was ready with a quilt on the bed and blue flax dried in a vase on the night table. Seal stretched and made a small cat sound. I watched her circle the dogs and sniff the air. Caleb came out and stood beside me. "When will we sing?" he whispered. I shook my head, turning the white stone over and over in my hand. I wished everything was as perfect as the stone. I wished that Papa and Caleb and I were perfect for Sarah. I wished we had a sea of our own. Chapter 4. The dogs loved Sarah first. Lottie slept beside her bed, curled in a soft circle. And Nick leaned his face on the covers in the morning, watching for the first sign that Sarah was awake. No one knew where Seal slept. Seal was a roamer. Sarah's collection of shells sat on the windowsill. "A scallop," she told us, picking up the shells one by one. "A sea clam, an oyster, a razor clam, and a conch shell. If you put it to your ear, you can hear the sea." She put it to Caleb's ear, then to mine. Papa listened too. Then Sarah listened once more, with a look so sad and far away that Caleb leaned against me. "At least Sarah can hear the sea," he whispered. Papa was quiet and shy with Sarah, and so was I, but Caleb talked to Sarah from morning until the light left the sky. "Where are you going?" he asked. "To do what?" "To pick flowers," said Sarah. "I'll hang some of them upside down and dry them so they'll keep some color, and we can have flowers all winter long." "I'll come too," cried Caleb. "Sarah said winter. That means Sarah will stay." Together we picked flowers, paintbrush and clover, and prairie violets. There were buds on the wild roses that climbed up the paddock fence. "The roses will bloom in early summer," I told Sarah. I looked to see if she knew what I was thinking. Sarah was when the wedding would be. Might be Sarah and Papa's wedding. We hung the flowers from the ceiling in little bunches. "I've never seen this before," said Sarah. "What is it called?" "Bride's bonnet," I told her. Caleb smiled at the name. "We don't have this by the sea," she said. "We have seaside goldenrod and wild asters and woolly ragwort." "Woolly ragwort?" Caleb whooped. He made up a song. "Woolly ragwort all around, woolly ragwort on the ground, woolly ragwort grows and grows, woolly ragwort in your nose." Sarah and Papa laughed, and the dogs lifted their heads and thumped their tails against the wood floor. Seal sat on a kitchen chair and watched us with her yellow eyes. We ate Sarah's stew, the late light coming through the windows. Papa had baked bread that was still warm from the fire. "The stew's fine," said Papa. "Yep." Sarah nodded. "The bread, too." "What does yep mean?" asked Caleb. "In Maine, it means yes," said Sarah. "Do you want more stew?" "Yep," said Caleb. "Yep," echoed my father. After dinner, Sarah told us about William. He has a gray and white boat named Kittiwake. She looked out the window. That is a small gull found way off the shore where William fishes. There are 3 ants who live near us. They wear silk dresses and no shoes. You would love them. Yep, said Caleb. Does your brother look like you? I asked. Yes, said Sarah. He is plain and tall. At dusk, Sarah cut Caleb's hair on the front steps, gathering his curls and scattering them on the fence and ground. Seal batted some hair around the porch as the dogs watched. Why? Asked Caleb. For the birds, said Sarah. They will use it for their nests. Later we can look for nests of curls. Sarah said later, Caleb whispered to me as we spread his hair about. Sarah will stay. Sarah cut Papa's hair too. No one else saw, but I found him behind the barn, tossing the pieces of hair into the wind for the birds. Sarah brushed my hair and tied it up and back with a rose velvet ribbon she had brought from Maine. She brushed hers long and free and tied it back too, and we stood side by side looking into the mirror. I looked taller, like Sarah, and fair and thin, and with my hair pulled back, I looked a little like her daughter, Sarah's daughter. And then it was time for singing. Sarah sang us a song we had never heard before as we sat on the porch, insects buzzing in the dark, the rustle of cows in the grasses. It was called Summer is a-Comin' In, and she taught it to us all, even Papa, who sang as if he had never stopped singing. Summer is comin' in. Lord sing cook. Well, I'm not sure about what that says. What is summer? Asked Caleb. He said it's summer. Summer. Summer, said Papa and Sarah at the same time. Caleb and I looked at each other. Summer was coming. Tomorrow, said Sarah, I want to see the sheep. You know, I've never touched one. Never? Caleb sat up. Never, said Sarah. She smiled and leaned back in her chair. But I've touched seals. Real seals. They are cool and slippery, and they slide through the water like fish. They can cry and sing, and sometimes they bark, a little like dogs. Sarah barked like a seal, and Lottie and Nick came running from the barn to jump up on Sarah and lick her face and make her laugh. Sarah stroked them and scratched their ears, and it was quiet again. I wish I could touch a seal right now, said Caleb, his voice soft in the night. So do I, said Sarah. She sighed. And then she began to sing the summer song again. Far off in a field, a meadowlark sang too. Chapter 5. The sheep made Sarah smile. She sank her fingers into their thick, coarse wool. She talked to them, running with the lambs, letting them suck on her fingers. She named them after her favorite aunts, Harriet and Mattie and Lou. She lay down in the field beside them and sang, Summer is a-Comin' In, her voice drifting over the meadow grasses carried by the wind. She cried when we found a lamb that had died, and she shouted and shook her fist at the turkey buzzards that came from nowhere to eat it. She would not let Caleb or me come near, and that night Papa went with a shovel to bury the sheep and a lantern to bring Sarah back. She sat on the porch alone. Nick crept up to lean against her knees. After dinner, Sarah drew pictures to send home to Maine. She began a charcoal drawing of the fields, rolling like the sea rolled. She drew a sheep whose ears were too big, and she drew a windmill. Windmill was my first word, said Caleb. Papa told me so. Mine was flower, I said. What was yours, Sarah? Dune, said Sarah. Dune? Caleb looked up. In Maine, said Sarah, there are rock cliffs that rise up at the edge of the sea, and there are hills covered with pine and spruce trees, green with needles. But William and I found a sand dune all our own. It was soft and sparkling with bits of mica, and when we were little, we would slide down the dune into the water. Caleb looked out the window. We have no dunes here, he said. Papa stood up. Yes, we do, he said. He took the lantern and went out the door to the barn. We do? Caleb called after him. He ran ahead, Sarah and I following, the dogs close behind. Next to the barn was Papa's mound of hay for bedding, nearly half as tall as the barn, covered with canvas to keep the rain from rotting it. Papa carried the wooden ladder from the barn and leaned it against the hay. There, he smiled at Sarah, our dune. Sarah was very quiet. The dogs looked up at her waiting. Seal brushed against her legs, her tail in the air. Caleb reached over and took her hand. It looks high up, he said. Are you scared, Sarah? Scared? Scared, exclaimed Sarah. You bet I'm not scared. She climbed the ladder, and Nick began to bark. She climbed to the very top of the hay and sat, looking down at us. Above, the stars were coming out. Papa piled a bed of loose hay below with his pitchfork. The light of the lantern made his eyes shine when he smiled up at Sarah. Fine? Called Papa. Fine, said Sarah. She lifted her arms over her head and slid down, down, down into the soft hay. She lay laughing as the dogs rolled beside her. Was it a good dune? Called Caleb. Yes, said Sarah. It is a fine dune. Caleb and I climbed up and slid down, and Sarah did it 3 more times. At last Papa slid down too, as the sky grew darker and the stars blinked like fireflies. We were covered with hay and dust, and we sneezed. In the kitchen, Caleb and I washed in the big wooden tub, and Sarah drew more pictures to send to William. She drew Caleb sliding down the hay, his arms like Sarah's over his head. And she drew a picture of me in the tub, my hair long and straight and wet. She looked at her drawing of the fields for a long time. Something is missing, she told Caleb. Something. And she put it away. Dear William, Sarah read to us by lantern light that night. Sliding down our dune of hay is almost as fine as sliding down the sand dunes into the sea. Caleb smiled at me across the table. He said nothing, but his mouth formed the words I had heard too. Our dune. Chapter 6. The days grew longer. The cows moved close to the pond where the water was cool and there were trees. Papa taught Sarah how to plow the fields, guiding the plow behind Jack and old Bess, the reins around her neck. When the chores were done, we sat on the meadow with the sheep, Sarah beside us, watching Papa finish. Excuse me. Tell me about winter, said Sarah. Old Bess nodded her head as she walked, but we could hear Papa speak sharply to Jack. Jack doesn't like work, said Caleb. He wants to be here in the sweet grass with us. I don't blame him, said Sarah. She lay back in the grass with her arms under her head. Tell me about winter, she said again. Winter is cold here, said Caleb, and Sarah and I laughed. Winter is cold everywhere, I said. We go to school in the winter, said Caleb. Sums and writing and books, he sang. I am good at sums and writing, said Sarah. I love books. How do you get to school? Papa drives us in the wagon, or we walk the 3 miles when there's not too much snow. Sarah sat up. Do you have lots of snow? Lots and lots and lots of snow, chanted Caleb, rolling around in the grass. Sometimes we have to dig our way out to feed the animals. In Maine, the barns are attached to the houses sometimes, said Sarah. Caleb grinned. So you could have a cow to Sunday supper? Sarah and I laughed. When there are bad storms, Papa ties a rope from the house to the barn so no one will get lost, said Caleb. I frowned. I loved winter. There is ice on the windows on winter mornings. I told Sarah, we can draw sparkling pictures and we can see our breath in the air. Papa builds a warm fire and we bake hot biscuits and put on hundreds of sweaters. And if the snow is too high, we stay home from school and make snow people. Sarah lay back in the tall grasses again, her face nearly hidden. And is there wind? She asked. Do you like wind? Asked Caleb. There is wind by the sea, said Sarah. There is wind here, said Caleb happily. It blows the snow and brings tumbleweeds and makes the sheep run. Wind and wind and wind. Caleb stood up and ran like the wind, and the sheep ran after him. Sarah and I watched him jump over rocks and gullies, the sheep behind him, stiff-legged and fast. He circled the field, the sun making the top of his hair golden. He collapsed next to Sarah, and the lambs pushed their wet noses into us. Hello, Lou, said Sarah, smiling. Hello, Maddie. The sun rose higher, and Papa stopped to take off his hat and wipe his face with his sleeve. I'm hot, said Sarah. I can't wait for winter wind. Let's swim. Swim where? I asked her. I can't swim, said Caleb. Can't swim? Exclaimed Sarah. I'll teach you in the cow pond. That's for cows, I cried. But Sarah had grabbed our hands, and we were running through the fields, ducking under the fence to the far pond. Shoo, cows, said Sarah as the cows looked up startled. She took off her dress and waded into the water in her petticoat. She dived suddenly and disappeared for a moment as Caleb and I watched. She came up laughing, her hair streaming free. Water beads sat on her shoulders. She tried to teach us how to float. I sank like a bucket filled with water and came up sputtering, but Caleb lay on his back and learned how to blow streams of water high in the air like a whale. The cows stood on the banks of the pond and stared and stopped their chewing. Water bugs circled us. Is this like the sea? Asked Caleb. Sarah treaded water. The sea is salt, said Sarah. It stretches out as far as you can see. It gleams like the sun on glass, and there are waves. Like this? Asked Caleb, and he pushed a wave at Sarah, making her cough and laugh. Yes, she said, like that. I held my breath and floated at last, looking up into the sky, afraid to speak. Crows flew over, 3 in a row, and I could hear a killdeer in the field. We climbed the bank and dried ourselves and lay in the grass again. The cows watched, their eyes sad in their dinner plate faces, and I slept, dreaming a perfect dream. The fields had turned to a sea that gleamed like sun on glass, and Sarah was happy. We need to stop now, but watch for part 3. Let's see. Well, we'll just do it. We need to stop now, but watch for part 3. Let's see what the Dove chocolate secret message is. This one says, Live, Love, Dove, by Tamara B. in Indiana. So very good. Well, I'm so very glad that you were here. I love you. I'll miss you till next time.